The person who stopped hearing from you is not thinking about silence. They're thinking about the last thing that felt normal, a message, a plan, a moment where the dynamic was still running the way it always had. And somewhere in the hours after they reach out and nothing comes back at the same temperature, something shifts that they won't have words for until much later, if at all. That specific feeling of realizing you were an option, not a choice. An option doesn't arrive with a clear timestamp. It accumulates. You start noticing it in small things. The way your messages got answered when it was convenient. The way plans had a provisional quality to them, always slightly conditional on something else. The way you were available, and they were available when nothing better had come up. You probably explained it away for longer than you'd like to admit. Most people do. In a relationship where the texture was always slightly off, not broken, not fine, just perpetually almost, there comes a moment where something registers before the mind has words for it. You stop reaching out the way you used to. Not as a decision exactly. More like a slow withdrawal that happens while you're looking somewhere else. And then silence. Your silence. And something unexpected follows. The person who was comfortable offering you crumbs starts paying attention in a way they never did when you were present. This is the thing that doesn't get talked about clearly enough. And it's worth sitting with because it runs counter to most of what people assume. The instinct, when you've been undervalued, is to believe that the only way to matter is to prove you matter. To pursue, to clarify, to give the relationship one more honest conversation, one more demonstration of what you bring, one more attempt to make the dynamic more equal through effort. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes directness is exactly what's needed. But sometimes what actually shifts the weight is nothing. The complete absence of the reaction they'd come to rely on. What surfaces in the other person during that absence isn't necessarily love or regret in any simple sense. It's something more mechanical than that. And understanding the mechanism matters more than romanticizing the outcome. Because if you understand what's actually happening in their psychology when your emotional signal disappears, you stop waiting for the return as if it means something about your worth. You start seeing it for what it is, a system looking for input it no longer receives. Stoicism has been saying versions of this for a long time, not about relationships specifically, but about where psychological power actually resides. It doesn't reside in being chosen. It resides in no longer needing the specific thing you were trying to obtain from someone who was always slightly withholding it. That shift is internal. Its effects, though, tend to be visible from the outside. If this is something you've been trying to understand, not how to get someone back, but how any of this works and what it means for how you carry yourself going forward, stick around. And if you're not subscribed yet, this might be a good moment to change that. Not because this channel promises answers, but because some questions are better thought through slowly, with company. There is something specific that happens in the mind of someone who only gave you crumbs when they find silence where your availability used to be. And it starts earlier than you'd think. You were the one who answered. That's it. That's the whole function. Not the one they thought about most, not the one they valued most, the one who answered when they reached out, who showed up when they needed the specific feeling of being received by someone safe. The distinction matters more than it sounds. In a friendship where the texture had always been slightly uneven, where one person carried more of the weight and never quite said so, the one doing the carrying tends to become something functional. A place to land. Not because the other person is calculating or cruel necessarily. They might genuinely like you, might even think about you warmly when you cross their mind. But something registers, over time, in how they treat the connection. They learn, without ever consciously deciding, that you'll be there, that the cost of reaching out to you is zero, that you are in some operational sense, the word for it is resource, and it's an uncomfortable word to sit with because it doesn't feel dramatic enough for what it actually describes. You weren't mistreated in any obvious way. You were simply treated as available, as the kind of presence that doesn't require maintenance. They could disappear for 3 weeks and return as if no time had passed because your reception was guaranteed. You were what they reached for when they needed something warm and easy. What the body knows before the mind does in these dynamics is that the exchange isn't even. There's a quality that accumulates in the hours after certain conversations, a residue of having given more than what came back. You probably named it as something else for a while. Tiredness, a bad week, the general friction of adult life. It was none of those things. When you stop responding, something disappears from their environment. Not you, exactly, the version of you that was always there. The signal. Think about what your availability was actually doing for them. Every time you answered quickly, every time you showed up without requiring much in return, Every time you absorbed whatever they brought without making it complicated, you were providing something they didn't have to name to depend on. Emotional confirmation. The specific feeling of being received by someone who wasn't going anywhere. That's not a small thing to remove from a system that had come to rely on it. The first thing that goes when you stop reacting is the stimulus loop. They send something out, a message, a reference to shared history, a casual reach that implies intimacy, and nothing comes back at the same temperature, or nothing comes back at all. The loop that was automatic is suddenly interrupted. This produces, in most people, a sensation that they cannot immediately locate. Something registers in a way that's hard to articulate. Not quite rejection, not quite loss, more like reaching for a light switch in a room you've been in 1,000 times and finding the wall smooth where the switch should be. The second thing that disappears is the mirror. This is the one people don't expect, and it might be the more significant of the two. In a relationship where the dynamic was unbalanced, the person doing less was nonetheless using your responses as a form of reflection. Your attention told them something about themselves. Your engagement confirmed a narrative they held, that they were interesting, that they were valued, that the connection existed on their terms and would remain available. When you stop providing that reflection, the narrative loses its external confirmation. What surfaces in the gap isn't always pleasant for them to look at. You stop initiating. No announcement, no explanation, you simply stop. And the one who had been deciding when contact happened, how often, at what depth, suddenly finds themselves without the feedback they were using to feel secure in that control. The quality that changes isn't the relationship, technically. What changes is the information they're receiving about their own position, and that information, or its absence, is deeply disorienting in a way they won't necessarily have words for. The third thing the silence removes is harder to name. It's something like the arrangement, the unspoken contract that said you would always be slightly more invested, slightly more present, slightly more willing to stretch toward them than they stretched toward you. That arrangement was comfortable for them precisely because it was never acknowledged. It existed in the residue of 100 small interactions, in who texted first, in who made plans, in who adjusted their schedule, in whose emotional state set the tone. The moment you stop participating in the arrangement becomes visible, and visible arrangements are harder to maintain. What had been ambient and automatic becomes something they have to actually think about. None of this requires drama from you. No speech, no confrontation, no message that explains your absence. The silence does something that words almost never can. It removes the object of the dynamic without replacing it with anything that can be argued with or reacted to. There's nothing to respond to, nothing to misread, nothing to spin into evidence that you're overreacting or that you care too much. The specific feeling of having no emotional surface to push against is one of the more disorienting experiences available to someone who was accustomed to having one, and they don't know in the hours after they notice that this is what's happening. They just know that something that used to be there isn't anymore. The discomfort arrives before it has a name. That's the first thing to understand about what happens on their end. It arrives dressed as curiosity, a mild preoccupation, a vague awareness that something in the periphery of their life has gone quiet in a way that shouldn't matter, but somehow keeps returning to the surface of their thinking. They check the conversation, they scroll back without knowing exactly what they're looking for. They might tell themselves they're just following up, just being casual, just seeing how you're doing, and some part of that might even be true. But underneath it there is a quality that has nothing to do with missing you in any romantic or even particularly warm sense. It's the quality of a mind that has lost access to something it was using without ever deciding to use it. Seneca wrote that the mind, left without an external object to organize itself around, turns inward and finds the interior less comfortable than it expected. He wasn't writing about romantic dynamics, he was writing about the general condition of a mind that had been looking outward for its equilibrium. But the mechanism is identical. When the external point of reference disappears, the mind doesn't simply adjust and move forward. It goes looking, and what it finds, in the looking, is the absence itself, which is more information than they wanted. A person who has always been the one to reach out first, to remember the dates, to hold the thread, the moment they stop, something registers in the other person that isn't easily named. Not guilt, necessarily, not love. Something that surfaces more slowly, over days, as the absence accumulates. The specific feeling of realizing that a connection they assumed was self-sustaining was actually being sustained by someone who has stopped sustaining it. The mind in that position begins generating explanations. It runs through possibilities. Maybe you're busy. Maybe something happened. Maybe. And this is the thought that carries the most discomfort. Maybe you decided something. The uncertainty is what produces the preoccupation. A clear outcome, even a bad one, can be processed. An absence without explanation sits in the mind differently. It stays. It requires returning to. And every time they return to it without resolution, the signal of your importance increases in a way that all your previous presence never managed to produce. That's the mechanism. Not magic. Not strategy. Just the mind's response to losing something it took for granted. When they come back, the instinct is to read it as feeling, as something softening in them, some recognition finally arriving, some version of the moment you'd been waiting for without admitting you were waiting for it. And maybe there's a small amount of that. Maybe. But the larger mechanism driving the return is something considerably less romantic, and understanding it clearly is more useful than the version that flatters you. What actually breaks is the narrative. Every person who gives someone else crumbs operates, consciously or not, from a story about how the dynamic works. In that story, they are the one with options, the one whose attention is the scarce resource, the one who can engage or disengage on their own schedule without material consequence, because the other person you will be there regardless. The story doesn't require them to be villainous to hold it. It just requires your behavior to keep confirming it. Every time you responded quickly, every time you swallowed the imbalance and showed up anyway, every time you made yourself available at whatever terms they were offering, you were providing evidence. The narrative was self-sustaining because you were sustaining it. The silence ends that. Not with a confrontation, not with an ultimatum, not with anything they can point to and say this is what changed. The evidence simply stops arriving. And a narrative that cannot point to confirming evidence starts slowly, uncomfortably, to lose its grip on the person holding it. They begin without meaning to, doing an inventory, asking questions they hadn't needed to ask before. When did you last initiate? When did you last reach out to them? When exactly was the last time you were the one who wanted something from this connection, rather than the one supplying it? That inventory is the discomfort, not the missing you in any full sense, the specific feeling of a story about themselves that no longer has the data it needs to hold together. Think about a friendship where one person planned, remembered, initiated. The other received all of it as ambient and expected. The moment the planning stops, what surfaces isn't immediately grief. It's a kind of, there's a pause that happens, a hesitation before the next step, where the person who never had to think about the effort suddenly finds themselves aware that the effort was there, was always there, was being done by someone who has stopped doing it. That awareness produces something in the body before it produces anything coherent in the mind. A quality of unease, a residue of something they can't yet name. What they do with that unease is to reach you to re-establish contact, to send the message that implies closeness, to reference shared history, to find some way to put themselves back in your field of awareness. And this is the part that gets misread most consistently. The reaching is not an admission. It is not the confession that they always valued you more than they showed. It is the mind's attempt to restore a condition that had been providing something it has now lost. The return is about their comfort, not your worth. Separating those two things is, well, it's one of the harder things to do when you've wanted the return for a long time. Narrative control is the thing they're trying to recover. The story where they can engage or withdraw at will, where you remain a known quantity, where the dynamic exists on their terms and can be resumed at their initiative. Your silence disrupted that story, not by arguing against it, but by removing the conditions required for it to function. You can't control a narrative whose other participant has stepped out of the frame. The return, then, is less about you and more about the specific sensation of losing a dynamic they had assumed was stable. They come back to find the version of you that confirmed their story. What they find, if enough has shifted internally on your end, is something else entirely. While all of that is happening in them, something quieter is happening in you. It doesn't feel like strength at first. It feels more like tiredness that finally got permission to exist. The specific feeling of not reaching out, not as discipline, not as strategy, but because somewhere in the body something has shifted, and the reaching no longer feels like a natural next step. That feeling has a quality to it that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. A kind of stillness that isn't emptiness. The absence of a pull you'd been so accustomed to that you'd stopped noticing it was there. What surfaces in that stillness, slowly, is information about what you'd been doing, not in a self-critical way necessarily. More like something registers with a clarity that the noise of constant engagement had been obscuring. You start to see the shape of what you'd accepted, the terms you'd agreed to without ever formally agreeing, the standard you'd applied to yourself, always responsive, always available, always willing to interpret their behavior generously, that you never applied back in the other direction. In a personal context where you've been the one managing the emotional temperature of a connection for longer than you can clearly remember, the moment you stop managing it is the moment you realize how much energy managing it was consuming. It's not dramatic. There's no revelation, no sudden clarity that arrives like light through a window. What the body knows before the mind articulates it is simply this: the effort was real, and its absence feels different than you expected. Less like loss, more like, there was a sentence here about what it resembles, but the closer word might just be space. Room to notice what you actually think about the whole thing, separate from the task of maintaining it. What that space reveals, over time, is a recalibration of what you're willing to carry going forward. Not a decision made in anger, not a wall, just a clearer sense emerging from the residue of having finally stopped of what a connection needs to feel like before you invest in it the way you were investing in that one. That's the transformation. It's not visible from the outside, but it's the thing that makes the difference between the version of you they come back hoping to find and the version that's actually there when they arrive. They reach out. And this is the part that's hard to say cleanly. The first thing that happens isn't relief. Something registers, but it's complicated in a way you weren't expecting it to be. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Something more complicated, the specific feeling of a moment you'd imagined many times arriving in a form that doesn't match any of the versions you rehearsed. Here is what the return proves: that the dynamic was not as stable as they presented it, that your presence was doing more work than they acknowledged, possibly more than they consciously knew, that the absence of your emotional signal created enough discomfort to produce action. These are real things. They matter. It would be dishonest to pretend they don't carry any information. Here is what the return does not prove: that they have changed, that the thing which made the dynamic lopsided has been examined and addressed, that if you restore your availability to its previous level, the pattern will be different this time. The return is data about their discomfort, not data about their growth. Treating it as the latter when it is only the former is how the same dynamic reassembles itself, slightly repositioned, and continues. In a romantic context where the distance had become undeniable, where one person had been consistently present and the other consistently provisional, the return tends to arrive wearing the language of feeling. They missed you. They've been thinking about you. Things feel different now. And some of that may be true in the moment they say it. What the body knows before the mind reasons it through, though, is that people in discomfort generate emotion readily. The sensation of losing something produces real feeling. Real feeling and genuine change are not the same thing, and the residue of having confused them before tends to sit in the body as a kind of wariness that doesn't entirely go away just because the contact has resumed. So the question isn't whether their return means something. It does. The question is what you do with it. And this is where your response becomes the more significant event, because how you receive the return determines what the next chapter of the dynamic actually looks like. If you receive it with the same warmth and availability you had before, quickly, fully, without requiring anything different, you have effectively told them that the cost of the previous behavior was temporary, that the consequence was a brief interruption, that the arrangement, with minor adjustments for appearances, can continue on its old terms. The discomfort they felt will dissipate, and with it, whatever reconsideration the silence had forced. If you receive it differently, not coldly, not with punishment, but with a quality that reflects what has actually shifted in you during the silence, something else becomes possible. What surfaces in that kind of reception is information for both of you. They encounter a version of you that is no longer organized around their comfort. You discover in real time whether what they're returning to is you or the version of you that was easier to take for granted. Those are different things. The specific feeling of that distinction, as it plays out in an actual conversation rather than a hypothetical, tends to be clarifying in a way that nothing else quite is. The return is a beginning, not a resolution. What it begins depends almost entirely on what you bring to it. What remains after all of it is not what most people expect. It isn't triumph. There's no particular satisfaction in having been right about the dynamic, no clean resolution that makes the previous imbalance feel retroactively acceptable because it led somewhere instructive. What surfaces instead is quieter than that, and more durable, a quality of knowing, settled somewhere in the body, that doesn't require external confirmation to hold its shape. You know what the connection was. You know what you were providing and what you were receiving in return. You know with a clarity that the noise of active pursuit had been obscuring for a long time what the actual terms of the arrangement were. That knowledge changes what you're willing to enter into going forward. Not through bitterness. Bitterness is just attachment wearing a different expression, and it keeps you just as organized around the other person as longing did. What changes is something more structural. The residue of having gone through this particular process is a recalibrated sense of what a connection needs to feel like before it earns the level of investment you were previously giving away without conditions. In a personal context, in yourself, in the private accounting that happens when the noise finally settles, you find that you can identify now the specific feeling of a dynamic that is asking more from you than it is returning. That feeling was always there. What the body knows before the mind articulates it is that the signal was present in dozens of small interactions you explained away. The difference, having come through the silence and whatever followed it, is that you no longer need the explanation to feel adequate. The signal is enough. You trust it in a way you didn't before. In a friendship where the texture had always been, well, you know the texture by now. The difference isn't that you've closed yourself to that person or to connection in general. It's that you're no longer organized around the hope that availability, generously extended, will eventually be recognized and matched. Some connections recalibrate when the terms shift, others don't survive the recalibration, and what the process reveals is that they were only functioning because you were absorbing the imbalance. Both outcomes tell you something real. Where you end up, if you've actually moved through this, rather than just waited it out, is a place that doesn't have a dramatic name. Not healed, not transformed, not arrived, just clearer about what you'll carry, about what you'll hand back, about what it actually feels like when something is mutual rather than managed. And the question that tends to stay, once all the noise has settled, the one that doesn't resolve itself neatly into any answer, is simply this: how long did you know before you let yourself act on it? There's a version of this that you carry forward and a version that you put down. The difference between them isn't time. It isn't the other person doing something different, or saying the right thing, or returning in a way that finally feels adequate. The difference is whether you've actually absorbed what the silence taught you, not as a technique for producing a particular response in someone else, but as information about yourself, about what you were accepting, about the specific feeling of a connection that was taking more from you than you were consciously aware of giving. The Stoic framing for this, stripped of its more formal language, is something like, the quality of your life is largely determined by what you allow to have claim on your attention and your energy. Not by dramatic decision, not by a single moment of clarity, but by the accumulated weight of 100 small choices about what you engage with and at what depth. The person who gave you crumbs was never, in any meaningful sense, the central problem. The central thing, the thing worth sitting with long enough to actually see, is why the crumbs were acceptable for as long as they were, what the arrangement was providing that made the imbalance feel tolerable, what it would have meant to stop accepting it earlier, and why that felt harder than continuing. Those aren't comfortable questions. Most people get close to them and then find something else to think about, which is a reasonable and human response. But the discomfort of the questions is considerably smaller than the residue of leaving them unexamined. What surfaces when you avoid them tends to be the same dynamic, slightly repositioned, with someone new in the other role. In a quiet moment with yourself, not when you're processing out loud to someone else, not when you're constructing the version of the story that makes you look reasonable, but actually with yourself, the most honest thing available is usually already there. The body knew the texture of this connection long before you had words for it. The sensation that something was off, that the terms were lopsided, that what was being offered was not what was being implied, that registered somewhere before you had an explanation for it. The question is not whether the signal was present. The question is what you're going to do with the fact that you're now more fluent in reading it. Because that's the real outcome if there is one. Not that the other person came back. Not that you proved something about your own value through their renewed interest. Not that the dynamic corrected itself. The outcome is that you are now less likely to spend 2 years absorbing an imbalance before noticing it has a cost. That's not a small thing. It might be the only thing in this whole process that belongs entirely to you. If you've been watching these and finding something useful in them, subscribing costs nothing and helps everything. Same with the like button. Same with the hype thing that appears after, that's how this works. Thanks. What you're willing to accept from someone, quietly, without making it a confrontation, without even fully naming it to yourself, that's not a small thing to examine. That's the whole